Hey everybody, I'm Melissa McKay. I am a developer advocate with JFrog, really into educating the community, finding ways to make developers' lives easier. And I am here with...
Hey, I'm Damian Curry. I'm the technical director for community and alliances at NGINX. And yeah, I've got the same thing. We love talking about infrastructure and how we should actually be building these applications and all the infrastructure they require.
So this is episode 3 that we're doing together. It is the one where we considered security. So
Yeah.
today are going to talk about what we need. It probably should have talked about even earlier than now, but I think we're doing pretty good with our little project we have going here.
Yeah, we're at least talking about it now instead of waiting till the end and going, oh yeah, people might want to see some of that security stuff, right? And not just the, production level security. It's not just when it goes live and you need to set up your access to the systems that are actually running it, but how do we build all of this so that we know it doesn't have an exploit built into it?
Yeah, exactly. So just to recap, we have our little application. We're using a Spring Pet Clinic Cloud app, an existing application that's open and available on GitHub. And we brought it into our own little organization that we're going to be working with just to get it up to speed with our own ideas for a demo. And last episode, we talked about getting our development environment set up, getting our continuous integration environment set up, getting an actual build up and running and going. And we have all that, are happy with everything we decided there and even our planning as well moving forward. But now it's time to really discuss what we're missing. And it's a pretty big deal right now.
Yeah. And it's a lot of kind of new concepts, right? Or at least new terminology, a lot of the same concepts of things we've always been worried about, but now there's a lot more public worry about a lot of it, it seems.
Exactly. So anyone that's done a Spring application before or, worked with Spring Boot at all, that you can have this awesome framework underneath you. You have a lot of stuff that's already done for you. But when you build, you're not only building an application that includes the code that you've actually written, that is on your screen in front of you that you have, modified or added to, but you're actually bringing in a lot of other things as well. So I want to start this off with just a chat with you, Damian, about your thoughts on using open source, why we do it, and just how prevalent it is.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that, as being the kind of old school open source folks, it's always been in the back of your mind. And, that consideration of, while there is all the plus sides of having these open source tools and, just being able to include other libraries and just, thinking you're going to simplify it, it's always been one of those things that's, kind of floated around the back of my head. It's like, okay, but what is that including? And what is that including? And you get these huge chains, and it's, even beyond just, your traditional application developers. Now, as we're doing more and more, infrastructure is code, networking is code, everything is code, you now have that same possibility to be pulling in all of those different dependencies into the tooling that's actually setting up your infrastructure. So there's even more of these attack vectors. But at the same time, the reason we use these tools is it saves so much time, and it's not that they're inherently dangerous. It's just something that you need to be aware of, and you just need to consider when you're making these decisions.
Yeah. This is a normal thing for developers to do all the time, right? This is a best practice even. It's drilled into us when we first start learning to code. Don't reinvent the wheel, no reason to do that. And to really utilize code reuse. So the consequence of that is even internally, even for stuff that maybe your internal org has written, you may have a lot of shared libraries out there multiple teams use and pull into their projects. This is all efficiency, right? I mean, it makes sense. You have a utility or some type of component that belongs with your system that has already been coded up. It's already ready to use. Why reinvent that or rewrite that every time?
Yeah. Well, and on the kind of other part of that is, and I've been definitely guilty of this, is as you're working through and your code is going through its life cycle and its changes, I've ended up leaving libraries in that I'm not actually using anymore. It was for, an earlier version, but you never want to remove that little part at the top, or else you're like, well, what's that going to break? Am I sure I pulled all the code that relied upon that out? Or, then also the, taking it too far and going, okay, well, now I'm including a library for something that would have been, 2 lines of code. And that library has a dependency because I only want this one part of it, but there's a bunch more in there. So it's a really hard balance, and just trying to figure out how to optimize for that. I mean, it's like so many other things that we talk about. There's no right answer, right? It's just trying to not figure out at the wrong time that you have a dependency you weren't aware of. And, kind of goes back to our conversations last time around version control, not just for your own code you're creating, but make sure you locked on a version that you know what it's going to do, because you never know when one of those dependencies is going to get updated and possibly break your build pipeline. Or in the case of all of the fun stuff that's happened in NPM over the last couple of years, somebody's gone and maliciously broken that dependency for you, and now your whole build is going to fail, or even worse, have some very interesting behavior that was inserted by someone else in production.
Yeah. It goes along with, we do our best to come up with these libraries that we intend to be used for long periods of time. But we end up with these applications that are several layers deep. So you say the word dependency, and that's a big word, because it's not even just the dependency that you've specified that we've talked about in the past. It's the dependencies of those dependencies, the transitive dependencies that also come in. I think there was a really funny XKCD cartoon that I saw not too long ago that did the rounds. Basically, it was this, building blocks that have this huge structure, and it's all relying on this tiny little block down in one corner, right? And presented a code base, and that one little tiny block is an open source library that nobody maintains anymore.
Yep. Yeah, and it's sadly really very, very true at this day and age that there are a lot of those, little balancing blocks that you're just waiting for somebody to pull out from under you and make your week real bad. But and the tough thing is, it's really traditionally been difficult to even know what all those dependencies are, unless you're, poring over your build logs or, checking that. And now it's come to the forefront. And that's where I guess the whole SBOM thing has come from. You need that. People want that bill of materials, which feels so strange to say when you're used to like bill of materials. Like, no, that's what goes on the big like freight truck, right? It's like, no, it's the software one.
Yep. Yeah, I like equating it to, ingredients in the food you buy. I mean, it seems like common sense. We should be doing this. We should know what's going on in our applications, and we should know what we're including. And I think, maybe earlier in the industry, it wasn't such a big deal as it is today, now that we're several layers deep in this mess. And, we're constantly learning, we're constantly improving. So as you said, there is no right answer, but we're learning ways to measure our applications, maybe better ways to decide what libraries to use, make some metrics on like whether or not these libraries are actually being maintained, whether they're up to date, whether they're current. And part of that whole mess is just knowing what you have in the first place. So yeah, SBOM, pretty big discussion right now. And for those of you unaware, there was a executive order by Biden basically saying this is a requirement moving forward for anyone that wants to do any kind of business with the federal government when it comes to software. Yeah.
And, it's one of the tricky things because, there's a lot of people and you'll hear it's like, well, this doesn't really do anything. And you're adding all this workload for people who are already doing this work for free. And, and I can't fault them, because at the same time, if you just create one, it's not helping anything. You need to create it and actually look at it and actually think about what you're doing. And so it's a lot of that is just, the way I look at it is it's a really good way to kind of, force people to do that thing that isn't developing new features, right? And going, hey, this is actually important. security, it's not just, oh, we'll put a WAF on it when we publish it. It's no, that's way too late if that's what you're thinking about security. But it just gets people to think about it, and also hopefully gets companies to, and people who are, contributing back to the community, to see it as something that is important and that is going to help them in the long run, and not just a waste of time for the most recent buzzword, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And just, I want to mention, this isn't just a US thing either. I know this was a decree by Biden, but this is something being talked about overseas as well. The EU has started, their own version of this kind of legislation. So yeah, it's not going to solve everything, but we've got to start somewhere. And I think it's a really good idea to have this list of stuff that's included. Damian, if you don't mind, I'd love to show you really quick just how easy it is to generate an SBOM with Artifactory and Xray that we have, which is pretty cool tool.
That's great. Anything that makes it easier, right? Because and I know that's the big kind of pushback I've heard from a lot of people in the open source community is like, like I said, we're already doing this for free, and now you want us to figure out how to keep track of all of this stuff. Because like we said, it's probably not even a dependency they defined. It's a dependency of a dependency. But if we can find these tools and make it easy for people to be able to compile this list, it's going to make it a lot more easy to adopt it.
Yeah. So for our project, we have Docker containers. We have our build set up to build these containers and, everything that's inside them. So one thing to mention is this SBOM, it belongs to a specific build, not a project.
Yeah. Because
potentially every build you do, right, could have different material in it. So one good way, something I like about Artifactory and how it manages your artifacts is it actually keeps build info for every build that you've done. And obviously you need to decide how many of these builds you're actually going to keep. And that can get out of control if you're not careful. But just really quickly, let's go and take a look at one of our builds. So here is one we can take a look at. We can drill down into the actual build ID. And we can go to the Xray data that is available for it. And down here in actions, we have this option of exporting an SBOM. There's a couple of different formats that are commonly used out there. So you get your choice of what to use. Let's choose Cyclone DX just for fun. We can choose whether we want it in XML or JSON. I'm going to choose JSON, and I can export that file. So this is something that I can include in a release later, right? Like if I'm delivering software to a client or something, this is something that I can include. And release package.
And especially being able to include a diff with, then they can compare it to which one, the one they have that they're currently running. And you can go, oh, look, there's no dependency changes, right? Or, this package changed. So instead of having to go through and investigate every dependency or what have you that's in the build, you're able to pinpoint the ones that have actually changed and might require a little bit of, poking at.
Exactly.
No, that's great.
All right. So we talked a lot about SBOMs and all that. This is something that I wonder, like, who all should be paying attention to this? Right? Who should be worried about this? I know it's difficult sometimes for developers because we're not security experts. I mean, we're totally on this end. This is not something we're used to looking at a lot. Other than, there are coding weaknesses that we should be trained about. Obviously, that's something that I've had the experience of doing on a team that was really valuable to me. So the code that I'm writing, make sure that what I'm writing is not going to be, easy to, it's not going to be vulnerable. I don't fall prey to some of the common attacks vectors that are out there. But aside from that, how, who else should be involved in this?
Yeah. And I know it's interesting because it's, always referred to as the software bill of materials. So you think, okay, that's that's the developers, right? That's it. But nowadays everything's as code, right? Whether it's the, ops, DevOps, platform ops, whatever ops name we're using today. I know I've had most of those titles over the years, but it's really important to remember that most of our infrastructure, like we use in our Mara project, is defined as code, and you're doing the exact same things. You're using a tool, whether it's Terraform or Pulumi or CloudFormation. There's all these different tools, and there's obviously the official extensions that are published by cloud providers and things like that are more I hate to use the term legitimate, but have a more of a track record of where they're coming from. But then there's also a lot of things that other people have written to fill in gaps or to find help make it easier, because it can be complicated, right? Like trying to spin something up in AWS using those tools, depending on what you're trying to do, it gets out of control really fast, especially, when you're trying to deploy a Kubernetes environment. So it's that you have that same behavior of going, okay, well, let's just find, oh, look, here's somebody who wrote something that's doing what I need to do. I'll just grab that. And, you got to make sure that they're not, inserting an SSH key, right? Or opening up a hole in your firewall to give them access to that, or installing a random package. So it definitely expands far past, where you would normally think of that software development team being. And, it's almost in some ways, a more dangerous exploit area, because now I don't have to exploit your code. I have your infrastructure, so I can do whatever I want. And, best case scenario, they're just crypto mining on your Amazon instances or something like that. Yeah, worst case scenario, you just gave them the keys into your private network and they have access to everything if they have the right access at that kind of operation level.
Yeah. And, we each have our area of expertise too. I mean, infrastructure and operations wasn't, for much of my career, not in my purview, not at all. I was involved in writing the code, packaging up end result and sending it over the wall, right? So whatever happened after that wasn't my concern. That's no longer the case anymore. Because, yeah, like you said, a lot of our stuff is now code that is also stored in, GitHub, and we all have to maintain, and we all have responsibility for. Now, I mean, like I said, I've been on DevOps teams before. I like the teams that are formed where, you still have your expertise. It's not everybody needs to know everything because we're humans, right? I mean, we're not going to be able to do that until we're, 25 years on into our careers. So that's unrealistic ask in the very beginning when you've got, when you're just now forming a team. But when you have, that expertise that you can bounce stuff off of each other, we can catch each other at different stages of the development cycle.
Yeah. And I think with so much of this, security at this level, it can be, intimidating, because people are going, man, now I've got to be a coding expert and a security expert and this and that. And it's like, well, you don't need to. It's not like you can't expect, like you said, I can't expect the developers to know how, the infrastructure runs. It's not what they care about and not what they're trained in. But it's about just having that mindset of, do I really need that library, right? Am I pulling in a library that possibly has a bunch of dependencies and a bunch of functionality I don't actually need for this one little thing that I could have written in a couple lines of code? And just being aware. I mean, hell, after the whole what was it, the Leftpad incident with NPM, what is that, like 10 lines of code in an NPM package that crippled so many websites on the internet. I mean, it took out it was Facebook and all of that stuff from one little tiny NPM package disappearing. And it's the things like that. And, it's funny how quickly it escalates, right? It just seems like, oh, that's just a little thing, but well, if that code depends on it, and then that code can't deploy because that code broke, and then all of a sudden everybody's down and everybody's getting yelled at. Yeah.
This makes me wonder, sometimes I wonder if, like, the word software engineering almost kind of doesn't really follow very well the other engineering disciplines, right? Because think about, like, almost every other engineering discipline, you need to know everything that is going into your product, right? Like just say for manufacturing, for instance, not only do you need to know what's going in there, but you also need to make decisions on the risk factor. If I include this piece of material, what is the risk for me moving forward? How much is it going to cost? That kind of thing. And we need to be, as technologists, we need to be more responsible in that area when we're choosing these components to include in our applications.
Yeah. Because like I said, it's really easy to go, oh, well, just include that and include this and include that. And it made my life easier. And then all of a sudden you're troubleshooting why a build won't complete for hours going, well, I didn't think I needed that package. Where the hell did that come from?
Exactly. So one other group that I think really needs to be involved in security is management and higher level as well, because this is going to bring along some maintenance costs. And these need to be considered early in a project and not just taken for granted that they're not necessary until something breaks. So this will make a big difference when teams plan projects out to make sure that they leave time for regular maintenance.
Yeah. And also just implementing it from the beginning. It's easy to get walked into, oh, we've got this deadline or we need to add feature XYZ. But it doesn't matter how many cool features you add if you have a weird security vulnerability that cripples your whole code. So it's always seen as we'll get to that later. And it seems to be probably one of the top things that lands in that, kind of technical debt bucket of going, well, after this release, we'll totally get back to that, right? And then somehow it never happens. Yep.
And again, this flows all the way down to even developers on the team. We're responsible to speak up and and understand what our maintenance concerns should be and be able to communicate those up responsibly.
And being realistic about how much maintenance is going to be required. Right. I think we always tend to underestimate that because it's, that's just a little bug. We'll fix that or, things like that. And I know it can especially be scary as we're in this stage in the IT world with all the big layoffs happening and everything and people wanting to make sure they're looking productive and making sure they're delivering on those expectations. But it is one of those sad things that it just gets pushed by the wayside and nobody thinks about it until your whole website's down.
Yeah. Now this sounds horribly scary, but we're not completely flying blind, right? I mean, we do have resources that we can use today, especially as we hear more and more in the media about, new CVEs coming out or new things that need to be addressed. Sometimes now we're finding out about these things before there's a hack. That's really what you want.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the ways that this is happening, I mean, we have the CVE org, which is involved in describing and numbering and identifying each one of these vulnerabilities and exposures. And then we have, another system, the NVD, National, what is it called? What does NVD stand for? I forget.
Oh, now I'm blanking on it too.
National Vulnerability Database.
There we go.
This, helps us gauge the risk of each one of these, vulnerabilities so that we can make decisions, what takes priority. There are so many, sometimes there's some that we just don't care about or don't need to be prioritized right away. So we can make good decisions about this. It's not going to make us all grind to a halt.
Yeah. And it is an interesting thing with CVEs because a lot of times, I mean, they sound very scary and a lot of them really are, but there's also, you'll see the headline and it's like, oh man, everybody's going to be vulnerable. And then you look into the details and it's like, yes, under this very specific scenario, if you're using this and that, and you're like, oh, well, okay, so this doesn't actually affect me. And it's that I feel like that's another one of kind of needing to educate, not even the development teams, but also the management of going, hey, I know this sounds scary, but we promise, I know this pen tester or whatever showed this vulnerability or this CVE, but here's how it's been mitigated, right? Or here's why it doesn't apply in our scenario.
Yeah, that's a relatively recent. There's a lot of work being done on contextual analysis.
Yeah.
It's one thing to get your list of reds, which, could include a list of libraries or packages, but you could be utilizing one of those packages, like you said, maybe you're not utilizing the part of the package that's vulnerable. And that's something we do need to pay attention to and make better decisions around. And I think that'll help, especially going all the way down to a developer who is now, more aware of these. It's not helpful for a developer to have a list of packages you can't use. It's not as helpful as the contextual analysis for sure.
Yeah, context is so important in these things because, like we say, it looks like the scariest thing in the world, but then when you actually dig down into it, it's not that bad. So there's such a easy kind of gut reaction of going, okay, well, there's a CV, we must make sure none of these packages are there and rip it all out. And in fact, sometimes if you do that and you go the extreme side, you're going to end up using something that, oh, look, here's this other random package that doesn't have that CVE, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean it's safer. It could have the same problem, it just hasn't been caught because it's a, less utilized product, right? So there's a ton of that where, I feel like a broken record sometimes, but there is no right answer. There is no right solution. It really has to be put under the context of what you're building and what your goal is at the end of the day.
Yeah. There are a few other organizations out there that have been started too. So we're not all alone in this.
Yes.
We have our CVE org. We have our database that we're working with. We've got, people rating. We also have organizations that are CNAs, which they are able to add to the CVE. They often have internal research teams that look for these problems actively. We don't always just wait until somebody gets attacked. We're actively looking for these. I know JFrog utilizes a research team for this purpose as well. And we are also a CNA. So we have authority. It's a CVE numbering authority. That's what that stands for. So we're able to add stuff to the CVE database for everyone's benefit. And usually CNAs will take a portion of products on the market, their own. Obviously we're going to be responsible for everything that JFrog puts out there, right? We want to make sure that that is safe and always up to date. And we are letting, making people aware if there are issues that we find. There's the OpenSSF. That's a huge one. They also have this, goal to make open source in general safer across the board for all of us to use, because we already talked about the benefits there. I don't think a good answer is don't use open source. I think that would cost a lot more than you think it would. The CD Foundation, that is another organization that has, a little bit of focus on security as well, at least partially. I know there's a working group right now that is involved in supply chain security. We haven't touched really on that subject yet.
Yeah. And it is kind of interesting, and it's so great that there's more of these foundations that are coming up and looking at these specific places, because it's so important to have multiple people looking at the security vulnerabilities from the different approaches, because the attack vector, the way that, CD Foundation is going to look at is completely different than from how some of the other ones are going to look at it, because they're looking at the pure code. And then, the CD Foundation is looking more about okay, this is how we deploy this stuff and this is how we maintain it and all of the different moving pieces. So it's really good to get all of those, different insights, those different backgrounds approaching the problem and trying to make sure that we stay in front of this stuff.
Yeah, definitely. One other thing worth mentioning is SLSA.
Yes. More acronyms.
More acronyms. It's basically a framework to help you determine how healthy your supply chain is. And it's composed of, a few different levels, how secure you are. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier. I mean, it's generally a list of best practices that we should all be following, but we can't take for granted that everyone is.
Yeah.
a really good indicator whether you are behind in this or whether there's some work to do to get your solutions up to snuff.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing because I'll be honest, my gut reaction was, oh man, another accreditation, right? Or another like, oh, you need to click this checkbox to make it. And then, like you said, you look through the requirements and you're like, well, a lot of these seem like table stakes. Like, of course you would have this, but that's coming from that technologist point of view. And I really think the more I thought about it, I was like, well, the good thing about this and the fact that we're having more people care about it and more people looking at this sort of supply chain thing is it gives us a tool to go back to your PM and go back to your management and go, no, this is why it's taking longer to build this, build pipeline, because I'm going to make sure it's automated and repeatable and all of this. And, normally they'd go, yeah, whatever. We just want the feature. But now we can go, no, look, if we don't do this, we're not compliant with SLSA level, whatever. And then that might get their attention, right? And it's not that it's the, be all end all and you click all these check boxes and you have the most secure thing ever. But right. It's a good way to, set that baseline and make sure it's something that people think about. And it doesn't just seem like that, oh yeah, in a perfect world, that would be great, but we have a deadline to meet.
Yeah, exactly. It's good when we have stuff like that kind of establishes a common vocabulary across the industry too.
Very true.
So internally, you may have your own ideas of where you should be as far as security, but when you're comparing from project to project, when you are looking into something open source that maybe a component you want to bring in, maybe you can use some of the shared vocabulary in order to communicate whether that's appropriate for your project or not. Mm-hmm. Lots of things. So we talked a bunch about just security in general. Let's talk about what we want to do for our project specifically.
Yeah. Well, from what you're already walking through with the Artifactory stuff, it seems like I like that because it looks like it's already going to build the SBOM for us. So I'm all about things that I don't have to do by hand. So I think that's a great solution right there.
Yep, I like it too. That's easy enough, and it's tied directly to each individual build. So I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, with that sort of thing, it is so important that it's this automated process for each build, because if you just do it once, you're already out of date by the time you've done it. And nobody wants to do these things by hand or dig through a log file and try to find the different versions that are being installed. So having it built into the pipeline is, that's the way to make sure it actually gets done.
Yep. From the developer side, I can bring in stuff like there's some IDE plugins that I can hook up directly to Xray, which provides me, access to the CVE database. With that, as a developer, I'm going to get a little more information about the CVEs, like possible mitigation techniques, things like that. I can also better tell if I'm going to modify a particular package, like upgrade it to the next version, or even add a new one in. I can tell immediately before I even check it in to GitHub. I can tell if I'm making my project worse or better.
Yeah, that is such a powerful tool to have that in your development environment. So yeah, like you say, it's because usually it's a, okay, well, I'll go build it and push it. And then you wait for the build pipeline to run, then it blows up in your face and you go, oh man, I didn't realize that was going to cause that. But having it just pop up and go, hey, you might not want to do it this way is going to save so much time and headaches for people.
Yeah. Or at least just give awareness so you can bring up the question at your next planning meeting. Hey, I'm thinking of bringing in this library, but there's some problems with it. What do you think? Can we run this by our security team? Getting communication going and at the beginning of the development cycle, super, super important.
Yeah. The earlier you find it, the sooner you can get in front of it and, mitigate it before it ever becomes a problem.
So things like that plugin, we can utilize that before even checking stuff in. But then even when we do check stuff in, that's another step where we can do some checks. And there's an open source project called FrogBot that our research and development team has created and put out there. I think we should utilize that. It will scan our GitHub directory and let us know if there's any problems.
Yeah, no,
valuable.
Yeah, I mean, anything that you can add in that's an automated process that can just be part of your normal build process, and being able to check things is, like I said, figuring out the problem before it is actually a problem that's the best way to deal with security, rather than trying to patch it after you've got something compromised.
Exactly. Totally makes sense. So our project we're working on includes a bunch of images. One thing to, get everything sorted when it comes to just the application. But now we're packaging with images. That's a whole nother can of worms. Sometimes that's on the developer side. Sometimes it's on the operations side.
Yeah.
So we, both need to be cognizant of how our images are being built and run. This particular project is using build packs, Paketo build packs specifically through a Maven plugin. Pretty cool. But some things I noticed right away that I might want to do is maybe control the version of like the builder image that's being used.
Oh yeah.
Because, it's going to reach out to a trusted third party, but still a third party to bring in that builder image and utilize that to actually build the final image that we're going to be using. That's probably something we need to keep close.
Yeah. it's like so many things. It's not saying there's anything wrong with the newest version, but you just need to be sure that there's nothing wrong with the way you're implementing it for the newest version. And it goes back to the, some of the benefits of using Artifactory, with being able to kind of cache those images and know that you're not just grabbing the same version from that remote one, but you're actually using that same image that you cached before. So you just have that next layer of consistency.
Yep. And then we can update on our schedule as well.
Yeah.
That's one thing I didn't mention. Like if you're always using latest, we're always grabbing the latest library of everything. Now you have all of these fingers going out of your project to various different places, and they all update things at different times, at different rates. They have different priorities. So it's best to bring all of that in-house, and then you manage that maintenance cycle for yourself.
Yeah, it is that gut reaction again of being like, well, of course I want the most recent version. They probably have a bug fix or a patch or, something, and I don't want to have to worry about that. But it is funny too. You'll see, your build times will go up, right? If you're looking at all these cached versions or going out and grabbing them all fresh every time, may just think it's like, oh, it's just a container, or, oh, it's just this package, or, oh, it's just that. But, you got a couple hundred of those that starts adding up real quick.
Yeah. Lastly, one tool that I wanted to look into that is more about supply chain is using Persia. It's a relatively new open source project, and it's basically it's focused on images at the moment, like trying to make sure that what you're getting is what you said and what you expect.
Oh, great.
And it's basically a distributed system that helps you determine whether a particular version is legitimate. So it uses multiple nodes in that system to do a build from source, if possible, in order to determine whether anything has happened to that build that you need to be concerned about. So let's say if we have 3 random builds that run the build and they all end up with the same hash, you're good. If one of them turns out with something different, there's a problem, and we need to look at that.
Yeah.
So Persia, once it verifies that a package is legit, it makes a record of that, an immutable record, so that anyone using the Persia system can grab that same package.
And that's so great because, one of the downsides, or one of the, I guess, kind of attack vectors as we have these more and more distributed systems, is it's easier and easier to get that man in the middle attack, right? You've got all these things out there everywhere. You can easily pop and put a node in and start distributing malicious versions of the same stuff. Maybe it's, 95% the same, but it's got a couple lines of code that will really open you up. And it's always tough, because if it's just one node out of hundreds, you could build it twice and only get it once, right? There's just such a variable of, that the worst lottery ever, right? So having another way of just making sure nobody's inserted anything in the meantime is another, again, automated, easy step, right? It's not going to take a bunch of engineering hours to test every single different package.
Right. Definitely worth doing. I mean, you think about, supply chain, I always think of the SolarWinds attack, right? So
yeah,
obviously somebody had access to part of that development chain, or not even development chain, but the, delivery chain, I guess. They got access to the build server, apparently. Pretty scary stuff. We need to keep an eye on that.
Yeah. And especially in this, and then SolarWinds is a great example, and as well as just there's all the SaaS platforms, right? So it's not even just that you want everybody to be following these standards, because it might not even be your piece of code that has anything to do with the attack. It could be a third party. It could be somebody your company is paying and is supposed to be very secure. But at the end of the day, we're all humans. I mean, we're all going to make mistakes from time to time, and we just got to figure out how do we best protect ourselves from that.
Yep. Well, let's move forward. Let's implement some of the practices in our project, get some of these tools up and running so that we can show how that goes for us, and we can talk about them next time, see what worked, what didn't.
And I mean, we haven't even really gotten into the standard security stuff, like talking about WAFs and how you set those up and all that fun stuff. So it's so funny, because it's been for so long in the industry. It was, well, security, that's the thing that when you publish it, right? We'll have a firewall. We're good. We're fine. Don't have to worry about that. But I think I've heard the referred to as like the security minded development, right? It's not that you have to be a security expert. It's just almost that you need to think twice before you type include, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, I think we have enough to go on.
Yep. More work.
A lot of work ahead of us. We have some more tasks to put in our planning project.
Oh, yes. We gotta actually resolve some of those before we show everybody the board again. So we'll have to make sure we get on that before the next one.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Looking forward to our next episode.
Yep. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.